has to do with
Eric.
how he's framing the social. I think what he's saying is that the social is always impoverished when you start from subjectivity. So getting back to more of what you said now, I thought the issue about individuality has to do with being exposed. That is that, this may get to the idea of Erfahrung. It's the idea of something I'm in contact with, and then I become exposed, and there's something at risk for myself. So the whole question of the subject is still present, but always in this broader framework. Now, let me just see if I can connect the other thing that was said earlier by Eric. I mean, the whole question of Husserl, yes, I agree with you now, he's always too quick there, but I don't think it's a matter of when you talked about a perceived thing. I think it's that the issue of subjectivity and intersubjectivity in the early 1920s is intersubjectivity is presented through Husserl yes, some form of analogical presentation. So when Edith Stein writes her work on empathy, even empathy is not really so much contact with the other. It's just the acknowledgement of the awareness of the other. So it's when you start from the subjectivity, you just can't, you always have an impoverished notion of the subject. I think I had one other thing. I went, oh, and I've written on this on an article too about the experience of the thou. Forget that even Buber, I thou is still too loaded. Certainly it's too loaded for Levinas. It's still a version of intersubjectivity. So Levinas's criticism there of Buber is precisely that it is not giving the other any kind of priority. And I think Gadamer would agree. Gadamer and Levinas are in agreement that way. And what Gadamer does is circle back to a notion of Aristotelian friendship rather than, so it's friendship and not justice that has the priority when you get into that further complication of the I, thou, the thou is truly other. All right, I'm done.
Yep, great. Thanks, Jim. Eric.
I already said this in the chat, but just that, should we be distinguishing the intending I versus the understanding I? The active, the agent subjectivity versus the point of being able to understand, like receive what the other says to me, right? That's a kind of subjectivity that one would want to retain in Gadamer, because there is an understanding I, there is an interpreter, or I'm not even sure if that's the right way to say it, but that seems very different from Husserl's notion of the I as constituting the other, right? The problem with the empathetic reconstruction of the other that Levinas highlights is that Husserl makes the I the source of the being of the other I, the alter ego. So with Levinas, or now with Gadamer, that it's not about the intending I, it's about the receptive I, or something like this. I don't know if that's a helpful distinction.
Okay, well, it's worth keeping in mind, right? The difference between those things. Saba.
So I wanted to add two remarks. One concerning what Niall Kane criticized in Gadamer for there being no concept of self or I, and that would be in accordance with James Rissel's observation. I would refer to the frequent formula of Gadamer that experience is always self-knowledge. Getting to know oneself better and better, and it's obviously something that must be conceived of as an individual and not as a general species of Homo sapiens. I would say so. There is of course no no strong concept of self or selfhood in Gadamer, but I think that there are good possibilities to build in such let's put it this way, narrativistic conception of the self, which is able to make experiences and so on. And the second remark would concern the proximity of Gadamer and Levinas. Jens addressed a minute ago. I always thought that there is a deep difference between Levinas and Gadamer in treating alterity, in the sense that alterity is interesting for Levinas for its own sake. The other as other, and for Gadamer, alterity or the other is interesting only as a source of knowledge, as a source of possible proofs. So the dialogue with the other is not interesting in order to get a revelation from the other, but it's interesting because the other might be right on this or that issue. And I think that's a fundamental difference. And it seems to me that there are Levinas scholars who criticize Gadamer for not being sufficiently radical in thinking the alterity of the other. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Csaba. John Beach. You may have to unmute again, John.
I think that Niall has brought out a very convincing distinction between Gadamer and Heidegger. There's no sort of like resolute clarity on the in a sense that, I mean, there is, but in Gadamer, he always mentions when he talks about facticity, he talks about the unclarity of it, and he also talks about the fact that there's no self-transparency of the self. It's unattainable. It's an ongoing thing that's always changing. And that's why he talks about the other. That's why we have to continually address the other, because it's only that we can transform ourselves, but not stay fixed. And so I think but I think Gadamer quite intends not to have this sort of the so-called self-transparency of the self, which is the whole idea of also in Heidegger as well, of the rejection of the Cartesian cogito, and which is like everything becomes epistemology after Descartes, and Heidegger. I hope I'm not one or two far, but Heidegger calls epistemology metaphysics that has lost its way. But it all becomes, you're looking for the objectivity, you're looking for the subjectivity, you're looking for the realism. It doesn't exist. It's not real. Realism is not real. It's a fantasy. And just as subjectivity is, and objectivity is. So that's why I think Dostal, spent a lot of pages trying to find the realism in Gadamer. It just isn't there. But at any rate, I agree with. Now you raised a very legitimate, very interesting question that I think is well founded.
Yeah. Okay. Great, John. I mean, Gadamer is clearly rejecting the idea that we can solve these philosophical problems once and for all if we can just get clear in our own heads what these ideas mean, what these words mean, and once we sort of map out these ideas.
That's the thumbnail thing about it.
Yeah, right. And
because we're never in our own heads.
Right. It has to always be through others, right? Through dialogue.
And through the tradition. Yeah. And through language that we use, we speak. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Niall.
Yeah, I wanted to come in because around the issue of self-knowledge and self-understanding, he's very clear. He says, genuine self-knowledge has an I-lessness to it. He says this on many occasions. So there is no I. There isn't an I in the traditional, there isn't an I in the traditional sense. He says that it's literally what he says, I-lessness, frequently about self-understanding. And I would say the I is coextensive with subjectivity. I mean, in some ways, he's in keeping with Heidegger at this point. And I think it's around the idea of subjectivity being necessarily connected to a subjective act, kind of a volitional thing I choose to do and could do otherwise at some point, right? So in the festive character of theater, that essay he wrote, he says something like, we no longer come to self-knowledge within the sovereign realm of inwardness. So this is a real kind of, so that's the bad version. And he says, we recognize ourselves as the plaything of this kind of mighty supratemporal forces called tradition. I don't think there's any room for an I or a subject in that picture. Mm-hmm. So that's where I find, so maybe it's better to talk about selfhood or some form of self within, maybe not selfhood, but forms of self in Gadamer rather than forms of subjectivity. Because when we think about language, we already overcome subjectivity altogether and intersubjectivity with it. So again, subjectivity is going to be tied to subjective act of understanding, and he wants to think about more in terms of this, as I think Jim said, abandonment or dispossession, being dispossessed by tradition, and one can only come to oneself by being dispossessed of oneself. Mm-hmm. Something along those lines. That's how I understand what he's after. Anyway.
So now, I mean, you almost quoted that last sentence. When we turn to language, we always move beyond subjectivity. But what do you think about his discussion of personhood? I mean, it comes fast. It's one page. He flies through history as meant as an alternative to talking about subjectivity. Is there room for thinking about an individual in the context of the conceptual tradition of personhood?
I think that's another, but that brings it with it a host of other problems, right? Okay. A whole Lockean concept of person, I mean, personal identity. He probably wouldn't be too keen on the personal identity theory of the self. So it's the mask thing he's playing with, and the mask is already something that's given to me before I give it to myself. I wear it for the world, and then in some way my who is defined by my participation, or better, my responsiveness to something that makes a claim on me before I know myself as myself.
Right, and in those relations that we come to be what we are, through his role. Yeah.
So the difficulty I had in the piece I wrote is he has a very ambiguous attitude towards solitude. He sees it as a deeply romantic idea, and then he sees a complicated phenomenon, but he wants to talk about it, but he's far more comfortable with solidarity. Solidarity is the better thing. Solitude is the risky thing, because that's going to involve inwardness again. And he wants to steer clear of that inwardness, because that will take me back to volitional subjectivity, and I can, a Husserlian act intentionality, and all of those things that he clearly wants to steer clear of.
Right, great. Jim Risser.
Every time I have a question, I mean, I have some remarks I wanted to come back to the group with, and Niall speaks, and I have some more. So first, back to Niall. I thought, in fact, David, your question of trying to then bring in the notion of the person, was very, very good, but then Niall complicated that again right away. But that could be a point when he talks about the portraiture article, his article on portraits. And there's this sense of the person there he's talking about. But where do I want to go with that? Oh, about solitude and loneliness. We're all familiar with that article, aren't we? Now, weren't you and I talking about that when we were together last summer, maybe? So how is that a romantic idea of solitude there over against loneliness? I think it's almost, I'll go back to his Greek sources. It's Socrates, a conversation of the soul with itself, so that the solitude is already some form of a relation to the world, whereas loneliness has that kind of withdrawal or negative aspect to it. But so my only last comment was John Arthos started all this. And also like that you drew the distinction between talking about I and perhaps consciousness from the subject. I think that's good to hold on to. because that brings me back to the beginning with John Arthur, because John's also the Recurrian in the group, at least one of them. And Ricoeur's famous three masters of suspicion. That is, when we hold on to, he was so right about this, right? If we hold on to consciousness, well, there's Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud all telling us that consciousness is a mask. We lie to ourselves. So part of that self-understanding is complicated by an experience of consciousness when we prioritize the I and consciousness. One last remark in terms of Gadamer and Levinas. I'm willing to share my article on Gadamer and Levinas, where I think Bernasconi has it all wrong. If I knew how to attach an article to this, to the group chat here, but anyone I'm willing to send my article to, I published a number of years ago. I think it's a richer association between the two.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I wanted to ask Greg Lynch. Greg, you had your hand up early on. Just did we move so quickly beyond what you wanted to mention? It wasn't worth bringing up?
No, actually, I had raised it right away, and then Java asked exactly the question I was going to ask, which was to John about when he says Gadamer moves on subjectivity. What does John take him to mean by subjectivity there?
Okay.
I guess while I've got the mic, I was just looking up to go back to Niall's comment about Gadamer talking about the I-lessness. So the instance of that I'm familiar with is in philosophical hermeneutics, and let me see if I just looked it up here. What essay is this? Man and Language. And there where he's talking about I-lessness, he says that it's a feature, an essential feature of the being of language, and then immediately glosses it in terms of like private language kind of consideration. So he says, a second essential feature of the being of language seems to me to be its I-lessness. Whoever speaks a language that no one else understands does not speak. To speak means to speak to someone. So in that context, at least, the point doesn't so much seem to be about selfhood and the nature of selfhood, but something about the nature of language. And I mean, I take it to be a riff on the, Wittgensteinian idea that the idea of a private language doesn't make sense. Were you talking about that use of it, or did you have some other instances of this Ischlosigkeit term in mind that I don't know about?
I was referring to philosophical hermeneutics as well, but the page number I had was page 65, I think. Or is that the same page number, 64?
Yeah, that's what I've got. That's what I've got too.
Oh, wait a second. Wait one second. So no,
I think it's from Man and Language, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's in the Boltman article.
65. Page 65.
Right. Yeah, in the the one that's kind of like black and brownish on the front, right? That Lynch translated. Yeah, so I've got, in mine, it's on page 65. It's, point number 2 in kind of a numbered list here.
Because I took that as the I that he's thinking about is a kind of an ego pole. But precisely for the reasons you gave about that kind of the publicness or the sociality of language, the I is always a mediated phenomenon. There is no I. You would find in someone like Husserl where you have a pre-personal individuating principle that then subsequently becomes personal. That's a non-starter for Gadamer. So the I-lessness is egolessness.
Yes, I mean, maybe something like that might be but it probably is right kind of down the road. I didn't quite see that as the point he was making here. I took it to be more a point about kind of the nature of language and linguistic meaning, that contrary to this kind of representationalist picture of meaning where what is a meaning? It's some sort of, representational object inside my consciousness, and words work by kind of expressing or pointing to those things. He, along with Wittgenstein, is saying, no, language just doesn't work that way. There is such a thing as linguistic meaning only in the kind of concrete conversational encounter. Which I take it that by itself might be consistent down the road with a few different conceptions of kind of how much ego-ness or selfhood we allow for.
Eric, what are your thoughts? You've been waiting patiently.
Oh yeah, and it riffs right along with Greg, but it was going back to Neil with the issue of, right, like, isn't there kind of multiple uses of the word I, some which Gadamer is avoiding, some which he's totally comfortable using. And so when we think about the I-lessness of dialogue, it's more like what Greg was saying, the transcendental representational subject versus the I as like the participant in the game, like I'm going to make this move in the game, even though I'm partly being played by the game. Just right. And so it's not that he's trying to get rid of all I uses of the word I, right? It's just trying to avoid the hegemony of the Cartesian I, something like that.
Greg? I think he was asking you. Or just in general.
I'm sorry.
I think so.
I thought he was asking Niall that.
Yeah,
I mean, I think I'm in agreement with Greg, yeah. And Nick.
Yeah, I think, Eric, I lean in a similar direction, right? That I mean, in a certain sense, the question, right? Is there an I? Is there a self? I mean, yes, obviously, right? Like whether there is some such thing, I think is not a meaningful question to ask in a lot of ways. But what a very meaningful and difficult question to ask is, well, what am I talking about? What am I referring to when I say I? When I say self? And I take it we're all in agreement that at a minimum, Gadamer does not think that the way of conceiving of selfhood that is embodied in at least the post-Cartesian tradition of using the terms subject and object and all the kind of corollary terms to those, Gadamer doesn't think that's the right way to conceive of selfhood or I-hood or whatever word we want to use there. But I think Niall is right that, okay, so if not that, then what, right? What is the alternative account of what this is that you want to offer? I don't see a lot in Gadamer to answer that particular question. And I guess one question I'd like to hear more from you, Niall, is that to be an omission or to be like an oversight in Gadamer? Because there's lots of things, when I read Gadamer, I don't find anything to, tell me how to properly cook a brisket, right? But we don't think that it's a problem that I don't find that question answered in Gadamer.
Not a very philosophical question, right?
What is the principle of individuation of the self? Is that a thing that not only he didn't talk about, but that he should have talked about?
I think he doesn't want to talk about it. I think it will take him somewhere that he doesn't want to go. And that's back to a type of metaphysical tradition of individuating principle, etc. I don't think he wants that. But I think he oscillates a little bit because in some way he agrees with Heidegger that when you start using the language of subject and I, it brings with it a tradition and with certain implications, metaphysical implications that neither of them want. So I'm sympathetic to what Nathan was saying, but another use of an I. But I think they would be vigilant against that too, right? But yeah, I do think there is a very strange in the solitude and loneliness essay. There's a very, very telling comment. He says he's never been able to understand how anyone would ever want to go for a walk alone. And it's like, what a strange. It really is the gregarious Gadamer, the conversationalist Gadamer, never actually countenancing the idea of going for a walk alone. Nobody should want to do that. You should always be talking with others. And in some way, solitude represents for him a kind of self-sufficiency, self-reliance, kind of romantic genius, someone who needs no one else to be what they are, kind of thrust back on their own capacities. And that's not his bag. But I do think there's a lack. I think there's something there which is not filled out. I don't necessarily see it as a problem. Solitude, for me, was a way in, because he's ambivalent about taking some aspects of it, but not really, really liking it. And that throwaway remark about not being able to, or not even thinking about the possibility of going for a walk alone, I think is, he doesn't, there's lots of questions. You're right, Greg. He doesn't answer lots of questions, but luckily the brisket question isn't a philosophical one, right?
Good, thanks. I wanted to say that in response to Greg's earlier point was that, I think it was Greg, was that Descartes is the low-hanging fruit. Maybe this was it's easy to reject Descartes. Even Husserl, with his kind of intentionality, wants to get beyond Descartes. As much as Cartesian meditations, he's not accepting the inwardness of Descartes. So it's interesting that Gadamer also takes on Husserl, Heidegger, and Buber, which are three different ways of moving beyond Descartes, that moving beyond the Cartesian subject, but none of which are satisfactory for him. And maybe all for the same reason, is that they don't properly make sense of intersubjectivity and the role of the other in the ways in which we can arrive at some sort of understanding of the world. John Beach.
Yes, I think we're all circling back to John Arthos's original question here, and he really put it starkly. It's clear that Gadamer does not like subjectivity. In fact, I would say that it is it's the bane. He calls it the crucifix, or the or whatever it is, of modernity. It's the cause of the danger, of the Heideggerian danger we're confronted as a race, as for our survival. But subjectivity lies at the bottom of it, and that's a philosophical way of forming how we understand ourselves, self-understanding, which he mentions here. I think here, which was a term that Fichte brought up, very, very subjectivist person. But the other hand is, if that's the case, how can we even conceive of living? How can we conceive of life? How can we conceive of ourselves and understand what it's like not to have the subjectivity as the self, as a reality? And of course, Jim said, well, Gadamer's a Greek philosopher. There is no such concept of the subject in Greek. And I agree with that too. And I think the only way we can get out of the trap that we're in, which I think, if you agree with Gadamer, is going to lead to our demise, is to find out how it could actually happen in a world, and a life can actually be conceived where there is no subject, where subjectivity does not exist, which is the Greek world. That's my sort of, but I mean, John is saying yes. John Arthos is saying yes. How can we imagine this? How can we conceive of this? How can we accept what Gadamer is saying? It's just not. Just doesn't. We just can't grasp it. And I'm just sort of empathizing with that dilemma, unless we go into the Greek world.
And one of the things he says, John, in the essay, is that he looks to Aristotle's account of friendship. Right, it was just sort of a throwaway line. He says, to solve some of these problems, I look back to Aristotle's account of friendship, returning to the Greeks. But then the count of person then isn't specifically Greek. When he tells this narrative at the end, it's almost a different conceptual history than a return to the Greeks.
Yes, because history isn't the forgetfulness of being, it's also the continual revelation of being. So there's also personhood also gets revealed along the way.
Yeah.
Especially before Descartes.
Yeah.
Big time.
Big time. Okay, John. And sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John. No, I don't mean to cut you off.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Okay, John Arthos. We're good. John Arthos. Did you want to get in here, John Arthos?
You're muted.
Yes.
Oh, you did. Okay, there we go.
Yeah. So, all these comments are helping me. And I think that Greg in particular kind of put your finger on like the questions, right, that are coming up about what does he actually mean by that? Because there is something profoundly paradoxical about the way he chooses to talk about all of this, right? He's repurposing all of these words like self, consciousness, I, um, the ordinary language. He insists on using ordinary language, which, is, I think, is fantastic, right? But in doing so, I mean, in that way, Hegel is a lot more consistent, right? Hegel, I'm reading Phenomenology of Spirit right now, and he almost never uses, he's always in the third person neuter, right? It, right? And that's actually much more consistent, right? If you're talking about this, if you're talking about spirit rather than individuals, right? So I find the use of the ordinary language of you and me and self and understanding. I mean, understanding is everywhere. It's in all of his titles, right? And yet he's talking about something completely different from what we normally mean by yourself and myself and so it's really wonderful, but it's also confusing. And that really revealing admission that he makes, that Niall talked about, is like, who would walk alone, right? It is a significant admission, I think, in terms of, maybe just who he is as a person, who he was as a person. Now, a couple of things about the Greeks and about Heidegger. One is that when he talks about the Greeks, he's very clear that he's talking about Greek philosophers, right? So he says, the Greek philosophers were entirely without any conception of, the inner life, of the inwardness of the life of the person and all of this. But I'm thinking, of, the Greek lyric poets who, that's all that they ever talked about, their own mortality and their own pain and suffering and how miserable life is and how they wanted to get in bed with somebody. And and then if you think about the Iliad is not about Hector, right? So Hector would be Gadamer's hero, but the real hero of the Iliad is Achilles, who's this really selfish guy who's mainly interested in his relationship with Patroclus and the women who
Shoot. See freeze for everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we lost John.
Frozen. But yeah, so I mean, the point is, as well made, that Achilles does not have a rich inner life. Achilles is just raging, just doing his rage thing, as opposed to Hector is up on the wall thinking about
While we're
holding the
waiting
sun.
while we're waiting for John, Nail, could you share where the quote is that Gadamer says that about wanting to walk by himself?
I did. It's there now. It's
Okay.
it's in the isolation. It's in the isolation.
And I'd like to push
I'm not
back
seeing.
against that,
Maybe you sent it to someone privately, because I'm not seeing it.
I think sorry, I did.
because
Apologies.
Gadamer speaks about the philosopher's walk in Heidelberg, and he talks about philosophers liking to take their walks alone. So I don't know. I'll check that out, but I mean, it doesn't sound like Gadamer at all. And the other thing is, human nature doesn't change from the Greeks to how we are today. It's an ontological thing. It's where the self comes within the relation to being and to truth. That's the difference between us and the Greeks. It's not. I mean, the Greeks have first, second, third person, singular, plural. I mean, they have all that too. It's not that it's an ontological stuff, and he's that Gadamer's talking about, and you can't get that unless you understand what he means, what Heidegger means by the fundamentum in concussum, which is not nowhere in Descartes, but which marks an entire new founding of a philosophical tradition of the West, in Gadamer's view. And you ontologically prioritize the self. That's the problem.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
that's all I want to say.
So while we wait for maybe John will try to find his way back to the chat. I'm wondering about, we've already had concerns about about Gadamer's criticism of Husserl. And maybe it goes a little bit too quickly, a little too hand-wavy. Maybe at this point, the criticism of Husserl where he thought was sort of well-established, didn't really need to rehearse this with as much care as maybe others would. But what about his criticisms of Heidegger? Are we sympathetic to those criticisms? They come up a few points about Heidegger not really taking seriously the importance of the other. Yeah, Shaba.
I would have also a remark and a question here. It is interesting in Gadamer's argumentation that that on the one hand he defends Heidegger at first with the argument that Heidegger is not really interested in describing the other as an essential part or aspect of Dasein or human being. But later on, he says that Heidegger in Being and Time did not sufficiently consider to take into account the other as others. So there is a tension, I think, in this argumentation, because either we say that Heidegger would have said much more about the other as other, or we say that there were certain contextual argument for not doing so. And that's the question I'm particularly interested in. There is this remark on Heidegger's distinction between authenticity and inauthenticity, which should be, according to Gadamer, reduced to a Christian Gedankenkreis, a Christian intellectual framework. And I'm quite sure that Heidegger would not agree on that, because in Being and Time, the distinction between authenticity and inauthenticity is developed in a way that in every possible human cohabitation, and so in every possible culture, this distinction between being the one who I am, and being the one who is dictated or prescribed by others, simply must exist. So I'm really curious about what you think about this.
Yeah, it's on page 134 of the newer translation, and what is it on my translation? 283, where he says that, here's the more recent translation. For Heidegger, what matters is to circumscribe the thinking centered on subjectivity and to unveil the ontological prejudice of phenomenology and philosophical research that stands behind such thinking. Fundamentally, he proceeds in the right way, in my view, in an era in which all traditions have dissolved and non-controversial commonality no longer exists. He does not want to presuppose for this purpose any solidarity other than the one in which all people find themselves obviously united. And this is the limit situation of dying and death, which are always mine. And then Gadamer goes back against what he just said. He said, even this, we should be reminded, could be a presupposition confined to the Christian cultural sphere. So the suggestion is Heidegger is trying to put aside all these specific cultural limitations, just focusing on death. But Gadamer says, even then, we're just talking about the Christian cultural sphere. And then he says, in fact, Heidegger's distinction between authenticity and inauthenticity depends on that presupposition. This is not meant to be a fundamental devaluation. That's the inauthenticity. Rather, what should be clear is that what presents itself in the form of idle talk, the they, is absolutely not a common world, but rather a mode of fallenness with which one can hide from the radical individualization of dying and the community that comes to light in it. So the idea here is, right, for Heidegger, intersubjectivity and relations to others are ways in which we flee from our own authenticity and our own individuality. And rather than being a constructive source of self-realization, are ways in which we hide from our own resolute development as individuals by projecting ourselves to our death. But yeah, Shaba, your concern is where does he get the idea that authenticity and inauthenticity are specifically Christian notions, right? And belong only to this Christian tradition. Would you say when he talks about death, that maybe is conceptualized by Heidegger in the context of Christian tradition? The first part of it?
Yeah, well, I had in mind, yes, the German 96, where the German original runs like this. Auch das mag, wie wir uns bewusst sein dürfen, eine auf den christlichen Kulturkreis beschränkte Voraussetzung sein. In der Tat ist Heideggers Unterscheidung von Eigentlichkeit und Uneigentlichkeit auf diese eingeschränkt.
Yeah,
Also, so that's a claim. And I mean, it's not really clear how Gadamer would develop this, because what he says afterwards does not really doesn't really clarify why this fundamental distinction in Heidegger should be reduced to a Christian approach.
Yeah, so nothing he says afterwards relies on that claim about these being specifically Christian ideas. It's almost like a throwaway sentence. Because when he goes on and talks about just the role of intersubjectivity in Heidegger, not specifically Christian versions of that. But you're skeptical that this really is.
Yeah, so I don't really see why that should be different in a Chinese framework or whatever. So,
Right.
I mean, perhaps my intellectual capacities are too modest.
Now, do you have thoughts on this, or is it going back to a different topic?
It's not on the authenticity and inauthenticity as it pertains to the Christian tradition.
Is on Gadamer and Heidegger?
Yes.
Okay.
So I think there might be a hidden kind of influence on Gadamer. So Karl Lovitt wrote his habilitation under Heidegger, and it was on the concept of the role of the individual and Mitmensch, the concept of being with others. And Lovitt claimed that all conversations with Heidegger were shoulder-to-shoulder conversations. He says, where we walk together and look ahead at something, and there were never face-to-face conversations, that Heidegger would like to walk with people, but it was always shoulder-to-shoulder and moving together against the horizon of being. So it's always about the voice of conscience as the voice of being. It's not so much about the voice of the other, the concrete other over there addressing me. I think Lovitt and Gadamer were quite close. And I wonder if that critique of Heidegger, if there is that critique of Heidegger, comes in that way around the nature of conversation, maybe Heidegger, it's kind of a vertical experience as opposed to a kind of a horizontal experience of speaking to another who can pull me up short, who can say something that can surprise me. And I think the whole very suspicion of solitude might have its root in a kind of a Heideggerian shadow behind Gadamer. So that was the comment about Heidegger and Gadamer, whether there is that backstory informing it.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Greg, is yours on the same topic?
It was going back to the question immediately before about the restriction to Christian culture thing. Just one. My read of this was that what he's saying is restricted to Christian culture is not necessarily the general framework of authenticity and inauthenticity, but that death plays the particular role that Heidegger thinks it does. So I took what Gadamer was saying here is, okay, Heidegger says, there's nothing that we all have in common any longer, except the fact that we're going to die and be removed from the world. And I take it that Gadamer's saying, but remember that even that, right, the idea that we're all going to die and thereby be removed forever from the world, even that's not a universally shared assumption, because if you live in a culture that believes in reincarnation, for example, then death doesn't have that kind of significance. So I took that what was limited to Christian culture was the point about death, not the broader point about authenticity and inauthenticity.
Okay, and authenticity and inauthenticity, though, depend on this idea of death.
Really, as Heidegger spells them out.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Jim Risser, were you going to say something along the same lines there? You've dropped out. Do you have are you muted, Jim?
You're muted, Jim.
Yeah, I had my hand up, then I took it down, but in light of the last comments, I had something else I thought of. The question of authenticity, even though Gadamer's really, it's almost like a soundbite. He's just throwing stuff out rather than, it's not a developed essay around that remark. But you know that authenticity is not limited to the anticipation of the possibility of impossibility. It's followed through at a practical level in conscience and guilt. And that's part of authenticity, because ultimately that's where resoluteness gets introduced. So I hate to say, my friend Gadamer, yeah, he's given short shrift here to a very complicated position. So that when you link authenticity then to conscience and guilt, that really gets complicated, because conscience carries the voice of a friend, a voice from beyond me and yet in me. So it complicates it. It was a undeveloped position of Heidegger's that he could have said more about the other at that point in being in time. But maybe conscience demands that he just say only what he did say. But anyway, I thought that connection, since it's on the issue of authenticity, to criticize Gadamer, he doesn't, it's too quickly of a comment he makes.
Okay, thanks, Jim. John Arthos, you're back. Last we heard was about Achilles.
Yeah, but did someone speak? Yo, yeah, I'm sorry about that. Did someone speak? Okay, so I'm next, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. So I really do think, yeah, death is really maybe the defining difference. So this is something that Heidegger spends in Being in Time, right? Then he moves beyond that, right? According to Gadamer. But in Being in Time, this is really the thing that, starting with the sort of the last half of the book, when he starts to talk about temporality, it's about sort of coming to terms with the fact that I'm going to die, right? Now, Gadamer talks about death, but he immediately moves, towards, burial rituals and all of this stuff. So he really, again, immediately puts it in the context of, history and tradition and generations, right? And the family. He starts to sound very Hegelian there, right? And I guess, so here's where I'm more on Niall's side, is like, I think, for example, as far as I'm concerned, it's terrible that Gadamer died. I think he died too young. I need him still to hear from him. And that's a tragedy, right? It's a tragedy that he died. So you talk about the death of a child. It's a tragedy. And why is that? Why is that a tragedy? And why? Okay, so does Gadamer really dwell enough on the tragedy of the death of individuals? Maybe that's a Christian idea, but but I think that that's a key difference with Gadamer. So I would throw that out there. And the other thing I did want to ask, because it connects back to something that Abdullah mentioned, which is Merleau-Ponty, right? And this was also this was already been mentioned before, that and Gadamer seems to be very dismissive of Merleau-Ponty, right? Because of this, because of the attention that Merleau-Ponty places on embodiment and the flesh and my feeling, my sensibility, my sensitivity of being in the world. And so I think, so maybe ultimately there isn't a difference between a degree of emphasis and moving beyond. Maybe they're all part of the same thing.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, John. John Beach.
Comments here on death. We did that paper, and that Heidegger wrote on death, or that Gadamer wrote on death. And death is something, your own non-existence is inconceivable. And Gadamer says it's not something that you can really think about or really sort of do much with, because it's not conceivable. The same thing Gadamer says about nothingness, which is a big difference between Gadamer and Heidegger. Gadamer says, talk about nothingness is meaningless, totally. He agrees with Parmenides, Plato, and Aristotle in this regard. You can't speak about the nothing. It's inconceivable. And so I would put that into the thing about death. And then secondly, regarding solitude, like that's just wrong. Now that Gadamer walked by himself every day. He did that, and he read Plato every day, which is the most difficult Greek you could possibly read without a dictionary, without a grammar, until he died, like at night. That was his bedtime reading at night, is to pull out not a bilingual copy, but he was, and the final thing is about inauthenticity and authenticity. The Gadamer took very seriously Heidegger's concept of fallenness. He took that as absolutely brilliant. Like we can't avoid fallenness, which is deeply connected with authenticity and inauthenticity. So I think there's a lot more Heidegger in Gadamer than we like to admit, that Gadamer would readily admit, but he speaks about things differently. And also at the same time, there's some key differences with Gadamer and Heidegger that we haven't sharply delineated in a sharp manner. And I think this was one with regard to the nothing is one, I would say.
All right. Yeah, thanks, John. Jim Risser.
Yes, I'd like to go back to the death and individualizing in Heidegger. In Being in Time, actually, Sein und Zeit, the page is 264. Heidegger says, as the non-relational possibility, death individualizes, but only as the insuperable possibility, in order to make Dasein as being with understand the potentialities of being of others.
Mm-hmm. I think you're accidentally muted, Jim. What happened?
Sorry.
There you
So
go.
that was it. I had a silent pause there for dramatic purposes, because it's always about, my death and everything. Of course, that's the whole analysis. But when he says this later on, I'm just adding something for further discussion.
Good. Yeah, thoughts about that? Greg.
What I have is not a thought. It's a further question for the more seasoned Heideggerians here. So I know that like Dreyfus and then a whole bunch of Dreyfus's students all interpret Heidegger on death as not being about like literal physical death, but actually what he's talking about there is kind of an existential death, like the realization that the projects in terms of which I define myself are no longer possible for me. And Dreyfus argues that, physical death, like kicking the bucket, that's what Heidegger's talking about with demise, and he explicitly distinguishes death from demise. My question is just how seriously is that interpretation taken kind of in like broader Heideggerian scholarship? Like if I were to make a venture to the Heidegger circle and trot that out, would I be laughed out of there, or is there kind of a split scholarly opinion on that?
Yeah, Jim.
I've written a little on Heidegger, so I'll venture. I don't think that's so controversial a point. I mean, it is, and you say the difference between there's demise, people die, and it's a whole question for Heidegger about everything in Being in Time. This is an exaggeration, of course. Everything in Being in Time is about possibilizing condition of life. So that's why he wants to describe death in some way as as the possibility of impossibility. And it's being in relation to that possibility. That's all. And when I would teach Heidegger, I'd say, but this doesn't mean he's morbid. He's not talking about, oh, woe is me, I'm going to die soon. That's not the gesture. The gesture is then he wants to link to this anticipation so that with context in relation to anxiety, it throws one back upon oneself. And so when I teach this, I would say read Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and that makes the point. So he's not going around being morbid. In fact, what it does, it reveals to him the character of his life, about his life. Come back to the issue of our discussion today. In The Death of Ivan Ilyich, Ivan, in that awareness he's going to die, comes to see his life for the first time. So it's so classically Heidegger and Das Man and everyday public life that there's this falling away. Well, the awareness that I'm going to die has this condition of letting one see one's life as if pulling oneself up out of that Das Man world. And that's how far as I think Heidegger is taking it. It has that, it's a limit situation that pulls me back into life.
Yes, Eric.
I wanted to ask Jim to say a little bit more there because, like immediately I start thinking about like the textbook introduction to psychology type stuff and individuation, right? Like, and being dependent on your parents, but needing to individuate, right? Like, is part of what's going on in the background, like trying to articulate a philosophy that can't be so Husserl, right, was trying to avoid psychologism, and is like, can I just say what you just said Heidegger was saying just in psychological terms and it still be sufficient, or does it have to be like through the Heideggerian avenue that I do it? This notion of individuation.
In the example you give, I do think there's a difference that Heidegger is after. When the young adult says, I want to be my own person, if that's merely saying, well, now I'm going to be an individual because I'm going to do this thing here, and it turns out that half the culture is also doing this thing here, what constitutes the real individuation at that point? So it's not just that separation, because one could still be in what Heidegger would call this everyday existence, which he equates with inauthenticity. So it is, I think, the horizon of death is linked to this, how this conversation started, to the issue of authenticity. And authenticity ultimately amounts, remember, it's a modification of everydayness. So authenticity is not a state that you've arrived at. It's being in relation to the possibilizing conditions that enable you to, in a way, actualize your life so that this is still a general language. It comes into its own. It's truly one's own. And there's some ways you can distinguish between mine and that has this notions of subjectivity attached to it, and just being one's own. So I could go back then to Aristotle. The whole ethics is about having your life become your own. And that's said without the language of mindness.
Yeah, good.
To keep going with you, Jim. So why use authenticity rather than responsibility? Because going back to Levinas, right? Like it seems that responsibility captures the one's own rather than mine more than authenticity captures one's own rather than mine.
Yeah. And it's very noticeable that Heidegger avoids the language even when he talks about being resolute, he'll put in the word choice, but it's not, everything's not about choice. It's about resoluteness. And if he avoids choice, he avoids for the most part, he avoids the word responsibility. But I think resoluteness carries that sense of being responsible for yourself. He won't use the word. I'm sorry for being self-indulgent. Let me say one last thing. In my paper on Gadamer and Levinas, I say the difference is that for Levinas, there's the response of responsibility. For Gadamer, there's the responsibility of response. So you've opened up further questions, but I love that expression.
Yeah, that's very clever. I want to look at two things that Gadamer says, one about Buber and why Buber and the dialogical accounts don't work, because it gives us an idea what Gadamer thinks we want, and also one about Heidegger and what he thinks the Heidegger account misses, because those both give us a sense of what Gadamer thinks a successful account has to provide. And the Buber one, and this is a little different than my translation on page 282. He says the problem with talking about a thou is it hides a mystifying substantialization. The I is already established, speaking over against the thou. He says it's great progress. We now talk about the other, because now we can talk about every other is at the same time an other of another. Just like he'll say the friend is also, a friendship's a kind of reciprocal relationship. At the same time as we are friends with ourselves. So there has to be a possibility of a kind of reciprocity that occurs for Gadamer, that he thinks the I-thou relationship doesn't always show. Maybe that's a place where he and Levinas have a little bit of a different story, or maybe you can build in the asymmetry into Gadamer. And then later on 285 in my translation, he says about Heidegger that we learn our limitations, not just that we're limited, but that we learn our limitations through the encounters with other, which is why I must always learn to experience anew if I'm ever going to be positioned to surpass my limits. So it's the constructive role of the encounter of the other as a limit on us that helps us to move beyond our own limitations, realize and move beyond our own limitations. And he thought Heidegger did not give the encounter with another that sort of constructive role, or as much of a constructive role as Gadamer wants to. So those are two things that Gadamer wants his account to have, right? Is to focus on the other, and we're always the other's other, and that it's that we discover our limitations through one another. I think we all know that's going to be through dialogue. But one question I have is whether his account of personhood, as sketchy as it is, does it give us a sense that he has given us an account that has that built into it, that it's relational, reciprocal, and has this idea that it's through others that we come to ourselves, through others that we recognize the limitations of ourselves and come to surpass those. Eric, what do you think?
I just want you to elaborate a little bit more. When you say, and he says, right, that last sentence of that paragraph you were looking at 285, like, if I'm ever going to be in a position to surpass my limits, what do you take him to be meaning by limits, right? Like, I don't need another person to tell me that I can't fly.
Right.
Like, is it just epistemological limits? Is it just my limits of my understanding? Is it limits of my capabilities? Like, how do you take limits there that Gadamer is saying that we need to learn?
Limits of my understanding. Yeah, the ways in which I've inherited ways of thinking that frame questions such that it limits the ways in which things could be conceptualized, set out, and answered. That's how I see it. But maybe that's in itself too limited. John Beach?
Very interesting question, very interesting topic. Going back to the interchange with Heidegger, exchange about thrownness, and whereas Heidegger, I think Gadamer, what I interpret Gadamer to be saying is that Heidegger placed too much on the concept of thrownness. I mean, he was right, because we're not just projection. It's not in our control. We are in the darkness. we are. I mean, that's the way Gadamer interprets thrownness, and we'll never fully understand it or be transparent to it. But it's also our job to sort of sort it out and to live through it and to sort of sort of determine our sort of who we are as well, dealing with thrownness. And I think that the relationship with the other is always it's another living person. It's another person who's dealing with the same. They're an other too. They're an other to themselves. So it's a it's a breaking. It's a stepping forward of both people to interact with each other. I think it's a positive thing because, as you say, it's the understanding that gets advanced.
Yeah, thanks, John. John Arthos.
Yeah, so about your question, David, about the person, right? So again, to me, that's sort of profoundly ambiguous in Gadamer, because on the one hand, whenever he talks about the person, and of course he always reminds us that it comes out of the Roman legal tradition, but he always links it to the idea of Trinity in this very sort of suggestive way, the three persons of the Trinity, right? So that is, fundamentally a social relationship, right? Because it's the spirit, the third person of the Trinity is spirit, and then of course the incarnation, the second person. So that's the sociality of our being together, right? But then he also mentions in this paragraph personalism, right? And there's no question, that Gadamer is this incredibly humane person, right? In sort of in contrast to, at least my image of Heidegger, right? This sort of distant person who can only walk shoulder to shoulder. And he's speaking into the air rather than to you, right? And Gadamer's the opposite of that, right? So there's something sort of fundamentally humane and personal about Gadamer, and yet, so it's, to me, it's just it's endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, thanks. I published a piece on his account of person, and I think it took me 10 pages to work out all the references that were going on in this. And I'm going to put in the chat sort of what I think is going on at the very end, because it said my message is too long. Hang on a second. Let's see if I can. Because it's just every sentence is just like a little suggestion. Okay, I got to chop this up into two parts about things going on. But there's the first part. Oh, sorry, it broke apart the line breaks, but you'll figure it out.
David, why don't you just send us the paper?
The whole thing? Okay, hang on.
Why not?
I think it's references to contemporary debates with did it work? There it works. With John Paul II, when he was working on his Shaler and Love and Personhood, and also who became Pope Benedict. Yes, Jim.
I was just going to say that's the missing link, the concept of person. When you mentioned Shaler, I'm sure Gadamer was half thinking of that.
Sure.
Thank you for introducing that.
Yeah, Shaler
That
gets mentioned a lot in this essay, right, in this paragraph.
Yeah.
But it's so suggestive, right? It points to a whole world of discussion of ideas of love and ideas of the Trinity, without any sort of sense of what exactly he wanted to take from that and what is just an open possibility. Like I said, Jim, there's all this open suggestiveness that's going on here without actually specifying. And this is exactly what I mean by that, right? Is he really saying at this point we need to adopt this theology of the love that was put forward by John Paul II in his Shalerian accounts? But also I think that's something that makes it really intellectually kind of exciting to look at all these different pieces that he's weaving together. Yeah, Jim.
No, to add to it, I was just reminded now of Hannah Arendt's dissertation on Augustine.
Yeah,
And she's talking about love in relation to the person.
exactly.
So yes, the person now is inseparable from some religious or theological component. Saying religious is perhaps better.
Right. So I'm not sure what to make then of the criticism that if it's even a criticism that Heidegger's concepts arise in the context of Christianity and make sense in the context of Christianity, when Gadamer himself is explicitly appealing to popes, to Christian thinkers who are using explicitly theological language for understanding these issues and trying to resolve this questions of subjectivity with an alternative view that is explicitly a religious view.
David, the way that I kind of take that kind of note of Heidegger being too Christian, that there's this kind of assumption of sin or something, right? Like you can talk about the Trinity and the three persons without having to get into issues of sin and salvation. And so, like, is Heidegger looking for salvation in a way that that Gadamer is not really worried about salvation from something? Could that be the rub? Right? Heidegger is doing this because he's still preserving this need for salvation from something, whereas I can talk about the Christian Trinity as a structure for understanding personhood without even getting into, well, but I guess he does say the Redeemer when he's talking about the Trinity there on 285. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the concerns of fallenness and authenticity that you find in Heidegger, I don't think you find that same sort of concern in Gadamer, and those have roots in Luther's thought and religious thought. Those are sort of existential concerns.
Yeah, like Gadamer is comfortable talking about his inheritance from Christianity as it's relevant for his philosophical reflections, but he's not kind of steeped in the need to save people with his philosophy. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, Greg Lynch, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I'm not sure how much I read the reference to Heidegger and Christianity in this essay, at least, as a criticism of Heidegger. I took it as more of almost like an offhanded comment, right? He frames it with, hey, look, we live in an age where we don't have any, there's no one thing we all have in common anymore. Heidegger points out, the one thing we've got is death. But then Gadamer, but remember that even that, right, is not absolutely universal, right? That's universal within kind of this particular way of thinking about death and this particular cultural heritage. So I think it was just, and I, from here at least, I didn't get the sense that Gadamer thought Heidegger would disagree with that necessarily. Just that it was just a reminder that, even the most kind of universal things we can think of really aren't all the way universal.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yes, John Beach.
Yeah, I agree, Greg, with that. And I would also say that it's in a recent, it's in one of the 1990s interviews where Gadamer's talking about the current state and the current challenge facing us. And he does say, he says, but we cannot, he sort of despairingly says, but there's fallenness, as if fallenness is a structure that mankind can never overcome. And, so he does, there's a lot more of Gadamer or of Heidegger that Gadamer takes than we sometimes allow. So, so I just wanted to make that point. It's very clear. It's in the interview. And I think that's quite, I don't see that contradicting anything that Gadamer has said ever. So.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, John. So we're into the final 10 minutes. This is about the time where I say, is there something people wanted to talk about that we haven't got to? There's so much in here that you would just spend the rest of the next 2 months disappointed knowing that. And I think Eric, I saw your hand first, and then we'll get to Eric. And
I just wanted to ask about footnote 4 on page 284, where he's just like, Bourdieu got it wrong.
yeah.
Because it's like, did he get it wrong just because he's in sociology rather than philosophy, or did he get it wrong because it's inaccurate? Like, is this just like field politics, right? Like, of course, a sociologist is going to get it wrong. Or is it a genuine criticism of sociology on its own terms?
So let's find the reference is
Yeah, it's just referring to a different article where he talks about Bourdieu and Habermas.
oh, it's true solicited as opposed to social political solicitude.
Yeah.
Where true solicitude, this is a nice phrase, true solicitude is not caring for the other, but letting the other come freely into one's own self, as opposed to taking away from them their ability to become who they are. So what is social political solicitude? As the socialist, does anyone know Bourdieu well enough to know off the top of their head what exactly the concern is? But
I know a little, but not, that's why I was like, ugh.
I think we'd have to
I
look
don't know, but I would like to comment
Yes, Jim.
on what the passage is from Heidegger.
Hmm.
Remember when, this is interesting too, when this is a point to bring up with the conversation John Ortho started us with. Remember when Heidegger first defines the who of Dasein. This is what people usually mean by the I. And you know, the first thing he says about the self is being with. So this is why the earlier conversations that Löwith and Heidegger, Löwith writing his Habilitation under Heidegger had some criticism because Löwith was trying to pull away and saying, Heidegger, you're not doing enough about Mitsein. And Heidegger is always saying, yes, but I have talked about it. So Löwith was criticizing some point that now was talking about. But what's being referred to here is where after Heidegger says, well, for the most part in everydayness, we live in relation to an indifference to others. So our social relation is fundamentally indifferent in everydayness. And then he says there's two positive modes, and that's what Gadamer is quoting here. Using the term solicitude, which occurs in the Macquarie-Robinson translation, it's a little bit awkward. So Stanball just, I think, says concern. So, you know, the German, it's Sorge, Fürsorge and Besorge. And so it's the concern with in relation to others. That's the solicitude, or just concern for others. And he says there's two positive modes. And that's what Heidegger is simply paraphrasing here. In Heidegger, it's technically the leaping in for the other and the leaping ahead. And leaping in is like the mother to the child, say, let me help you with your homework. So it's about what the concern is over. And he's still calling that a positive mode, even though it's not the most genuine, especially when you talk to nurses and psychologists and so on. And that other one is leaping ahead. And he describes it very strangely. It's being in relation to the other in such a way that you don't take their freedom away, but you give it back to them for the first time. That's very, and Heidegger doesn't elaborate. Irene McMullen has written on the we in Heidegger, and she describes that as a hovering attentiveness. And I like that phrase. So I would say, getting back to your question, well, the hovering attentiveness is not the same as the sociological solicitude. So it really gets much closer to some form of an intimacy, contact with the other. But it's still not, you could see it's not the Gadamerian other here at all either. That is the leaping ahead, just to go beyond the question of the sociological Bourdieu. The leaping ahead is quite interesting, but I think if I wanted to explain that to therapists, I would say, no, that's precisely the idea of Gadamerian conversation. that kind of a releasement. Well, that's a Heideggerian word too, but it's a kind of releasement to grant at first that the other may be right. And it's a way of freeing up in that way rather than trying to just assert yourself over it.
Right.
Oh, sorry, John, you go.
I just wanted to ask Jim to say a little bit more about, because I've never quite understood at the apex of Heidegger's, thinking over this question of Gelassenheit, that he says that, and this is in Being and Time, that he says that what this is all about is about giving someone the freedom to consider the possibility of death. What is that positive thing that you're giving someone?
If this is still about leaping ahead, death doesn't come into it here. So I'd like to keep the two separate. Again, I don't have the exact phrase, so I'm paraphrasing. It's being in relation to that other in such a way that they're able to gain their freedom for the first time. So I take that as a kind of, how do you say yes to the other person without engaging in some form of domination? Even when the parent of the child is a benign form of domination, it is still a domination when you say, here, let me help you with your homework. In fact, let me take care of it for you. And so that's the issue here about the leaping ahead that has and when I use the word releasement, which is one of Heidegger's later words, it's how does one go about letting the other be, would be what I take away from Heidegger's strange description. I would also add the word that I think Heidegger implies some sense of anticipation. And that's what could link it to these later ideas about futurity too. Because how do you, it's like, this is very awkward now, but I think it has a point. Wouldn't a certain positive relation to the others is being with them in such a way that their own future is opened up to them in a more interesting way that we talk about being in relation to the future now. That is, grant them with respect to the possibilizing condition of being open to the possibilizing condition of their life. Now I sound like a cheap psychologist here. One last comment. In America, we use the word people having possibilities too cheaply. We think of it like coins in the pocket. Well, you have possibilities. And of course, we know that that's not what Heidegger means by possibilities. It's about the gesture of entering into them and of taking them up, of being in relation to them in a specific way.
Jim, do you feel that you've been successful in moving to the Gadamerian approach of, well, you might be right? Because when I do that, people just take that and go, well, then obviously I'm right and you're wrong, right? Like when you try to be charitable in that, like, I'm open to you, they tend to not reciprocate that. At least maybe that's just my experience.
Well, we forget that conversation is entering in a medium of exchange where there is some form of contestation, or you could say there's always an issue. This was an early criticism of Gadamer. There is no room from Habermas. There's no room for critique. No, I think there is in a genuine conversation. You'd say, well, if you could say to that person when you grant them, say, that's nice what you say, but I don't understand it. And how are you able to maintain that in light of X, Y, and Z? Now I'm starting to sound like a philosopher. I'm looking for arguments. And it's not quite that, but it's in granting the other a certain freedom. That doesn't mean anything they say is legitimate. And it may be the question of a conversation where that person who says that, put them in a situation where they can begin to ask a question of themselves about that response that they gave.
I would say, Martina, do you want to share your example? Because that seemed to be right on the point.
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm not sure if it's relevant, but I am very struck by that idea of the authenticity piece in relation to clinical practice and how often as doctors, we are healthcare professionals, or just as people, we try to solve other people's problems in health, as opposed to just allowing them have the experience of them being, in my case, patients when they're dying. Like, I think there's something about sharing that knowledge with somebody and not trying to solve it, but just like giving them that freedom to know, you're dying, I know you're dying, there's nothing we can do, but we can be here together. And that's how I understand that sentence or piece from Heidegger.
Right. That strikes me as a great example.
Can I add just one last thing? I think
Right.
that's one nice way of giving an example for what I would call Heidegger's or Irene McMullen's expression, a hovering
Yes.
attentiveness.
Yeah.
Greg Lynch, you said you raised your hand when you said you had one thing that we hadn't talked about that was really important to you. Do you want to put it on the table before we go?
No, it's not that really important. It was just a thing I was going to ask about should nobody else have had something to ask about, but they did, and now we're out of time. So
Now we'll never know.
it'll come up again, I'm sure.
So yeah, but it is time. We should call it. And thank you everyone for joining us today for talking about this. We'll be meeting again in March, mid-March. So I'll send out an invitation. And if you have, I mean, this piece was requested by John and Don Marshall. And if you have pieces that you really want to discuss, please let me know. I'll add them to the list and we can vote on them, and that can be next up in March. So thanks everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Yep.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.